Well, I've been invited to talk about university teaching of history and the gap, therefore, between what I guess Penny perceived as sitting between what we do in the university history departments and what's done in the high schools. And obviously, from what you've just heard, there's not only no gap at all, but the high schools are ahead of us. But I'd like to thank Penny for the invitation and Peter for many conversations over the last few years. Obviously, I'm not an expert in working with teachers except at the level of the university history classroom, talking about Canadian history. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And my talk has three parts. One, I'm just going to take two professors who are extremely successful at their level and tell you a wee bit about their reflections on their careers and what they thought they were doing. Second, I'm going to take a colleague of mine, Ken Osborne, whose name is probably well known to you, just to sketch what he suggests about this historical thinking benchmarks question. And third, I'd like just to talk about what I do in the classroom and how I think it relates to the things that Peter is designing and that Mark's up to. So first, two professors who have been exceptionally successful in universities and what they thought they were doing. Their names are Eric Vogt and Robert Young. Vogt is one of UBC's most successful teachers over the last, if you can believe it, nearly 50 years, a co-founder of TRIUMPH, the National Laboratory for Particle and Nuclear Research, the lobbyist for the so-called K-On factory, and famed as a teacher of first-year teaching. He's still teaching, I understand, although I'm not sure if he is this year. He's been teaching for the last 10 or 11 years for free post-retirement. He wrote an article in a professional physics journal last year on the joys of first-year physics teaching. And here's what he concluded. Students enter the university with great expectations. They're not jaded, and their sense of wonder is largely intact. They respond to good teaching, and their learning ability appears to be at a maximum. The usual first-year fare allows them to quickly reach great heights in science. In first-year physics, there are endless opportunities to excite wonder and to make the students' eyes light up. Well, this is my first comment about university teaching. I think that Vogt is absolutely right, and that many teachers would say this about their first-year class, and indeed a number of their others. The sense of wonder and so on that I've noticed over the last 40 years is the same sort of wonder that he has noticed. But apart from that joy, Vogt had another message to communicate, and this is one that's more pressing, I think. Quote, "The general goals of any undergraduate physics course are to impart knowledge about the physics content, to enhance the student's sense of wonder, to develop the student's analytical skills, to describe how science works and how effective math is for this purpose, and to make the course a challenge to the intellect as well as an enjoyable learning experience." And so what I pull out of this is not just the developing analytical skills, one of those easy kinds of phrases, but through what means. And here he's saying, I want to describe how science works, and I want to explain how math clarifies that process. Okay, so that's what I take away from Vogt. As I say, a fantastic exemplar of teaching. The next step in my thinking is Robert Young, a winner of the Case Canadian Professor of the Year designation, who has taught for 40 years at the University of Winnipeg in the history department. On the surface, Young is saying the same sorts of things that Vogt is, but he has an enormous number of comments dedicated to a third theme, not just wonder, not just the language of the discipline, but a third theme, and that is, in a way, what he calls character. And in a way, this is classroom decorum, and I would call it perhaps something like work habits or something like that. But he uses this fancy old-fashioned term of character to describe what he's trying to get across. And what he's saying he's after is something like, I want to show people what work, effort, and application mean. that our job is to identify whatever is listless, cheap, or fraudulent. I want to hold the student accountable for the quality of work. And above all else, I want to inculcate a respect for learning, and with it a lifetime of openness to ideas. Here's the intersection where the ivory tower meets the real world, because what we as teachers expect is precisely what the community in general, and future employers in particular, will also expect. End of quote. And so this is the third of the three things that I see in these reflections by these people, these two teachers. The wonder, the language of the discipline, and then thirdly, this structure of habits, as I would call it, work habits, that they want to inculcate. So that's the end of part one of what I want to say. I agree with them. I don't have a problem with it. If we could do everything that they're saying, it would be wonderful. Second, now apply this to history. How do I apply it to history? Well, I've taken, as I say, the thought of Ken Osborne, a friend and colleague, to focus on these very phrases that Peter has been describing, this question of historical skill, historical thinking, the benchmarks, and so on. And go back to Vogt, saying he wants to describe how science works. Well, Osborne, in his way, has been doing the same thing in teaching teachers the teaching of history. And if you read his writings on the subject, which are voluminous and have been coming out for 40 years in Manitoba and are now reaching the national level, and to Peter I can say he's even writing a book on the teaching of history in the schools in Canada as we speak, so there may well be a response to that particular task. His main bugbear is, quote, the dry recitation of dates and facts. He says his career has been dedicated to eradicating this plague. History is not simply, I'm quoting, a list of items to be memorized. In the bad old days, the good teachers used to rely on human interest stories and the unusual, John A. Macdonald's drinking, Mackenzie King's seances, to arouse students' interest and counteract the bitter medicine of names and dates. But even that is a desperate expedient. Teachers in schools, he says, are now ready to move beyond such deadening approaches. We now realize that the best way to make history interesting is to help students see the past through the eyes of the people who lived it, facing problems to which they did not have an answer and whose results they could not foretell. We need to teach history looking forward into an unknown future, not backwards, looking to a past that textbooks portray as over and done with. Now, Ken then goes on in a number of his writings to talk about the work of Piaget and to extend it and to talk about how old students need to be in order to deal with the various concepts. And I'm not equipped, I've never taught in primary or secondary school to know what works when, but I will make a comment about it at the end. I'll just simply leave Ken there. So the third thing I want to talk about is my own work. Reflecting on my teaching, on my classes, and I've never done this before, so this is a bit of a shock to actually have to confront it. I doubt that I'm very different in my thinking from either Vogt and Young on the one hand, or Osborne on the other, or I suspect most teachers at whatever level who teach history and social studies. I doubt that there's a drastic difference in the basic goal that we're after. My university history course consists of reading assignments, essay writing, exams, and lectures. Each of these four components has many facets and many purposes, but no analysis of a course would be complete if it omitted any of those parts. Consider the essays. In first year, I assign a single book-length primary source as the topic of one essay, with the expectation that in reading it, students will situate themselves in the past, beside the author, and reflect on that person's historical context. The source might be La Vérendrye's letters, which have been published in Manitoba in a nice translation, Robert McNeill's memoir, Elizabeth Gowdy's autobiography, and so on. And each year I've chosen a different primary source, ordered, obviously you have to find the book that's available in 75 copies, put them in their hands and said, okay, respond to this. And I give them a sequence of questions based on that particular text. What's La Vérendrye up to when he's talking to the Mandans and so on. But the point of it in the end is to get them into that primary source. In a second essay, and this is a one-term course, the students employ both primary documents and secondary sources. The object is to ensure close reading of about 10 or 12 pages of documents, and then to enable the students to establish a context for them with the help of a few works drawn from today's historical writing, meaning therefore chapters or articles. In this case, the students attempt to link the original evidence to the historian's analysis of similar sources today. In this way, they convert primary materials into a secondary work by creating their own narrative or synthesis. So that's one part of a course.